morning, everybody.
Morning.
We're a nice crowd, beautiful day. I have a couple of announcements. First of all, just so you know now, there was another scheduled change. We were going to be doing second Saturdays in July, but that one has been shifted back to September instead. Too much competition for the same day, okay? So the History of Plymouth Hospital by Dan Buckman will be done the regular standard September second Saturdays. And hopefully next year will just be a regular boring average second Saturday schedule. So that's the first thing. The second thing, Don has asked me to make a couple of announcements for the Art Center. This is Gallery 110 North presents Alive in the Arts, a 26th annual juried exhibition that's open from May 7th through August 6th. I think opening evening was last night. Make sure at break you stop and take a look at what's in the gallery next door. And the other thing, the Art Center every year has this spectacular self-guided art tour in the northern Kettle Moraine. It's got about 15 different venues, outstanding artists. It's a do it on your own traveling thing, but it's June 4th and 5th. So make sure you pick up a brochure if you don't have one. It's a really wonderful thing. So again, to get back to the second Saturdays, after today, we are taking another hiatus until September again. But I do have one more presentation at Generations on the first Wednesday of June. That's the last one before we hit summer, and that one's going to be on Camp Haven and the mysteries of Camp Haven, the training camp that used to be where Whistling Straits is today. And I hope you'll all come because that is not one of my areas of expertise, so I need all of you to tell your stories. So let's get to today. This is really an interesting topic. I think well, they all are. But it's very interesting. Today we're welcoming Jack Mitchell and his presentation, Wisconsin on the Air. And I'm going to read this to you because it's a really good story. On a wintry evening in 1917, university professor Earl Terry listened with guests as the popular music of the day filtered from a physics lab in Science Hall into a receiving set in his living room. I love that out of a physics lab, too.
Yep.
It's just funny.
That microphone.
Yeah.
There you go. Okay. I know I'm too short. Thank you. Little did they know that 100 years of public service broadcasting had just begun. Terry's radio experiment blossomed into a pioneering endeavor to carry out the Wisconsin idea, a promise to make the university's knowledge accessible to all Wisconsinites in their homes, statewide, a progressive era principle that still guides public broadcasting in Wisconsin and throughout the nation. In 1947, television was added to this public service model with Channel 21 in Madison, produced like radio from the University of Wisconsin campus. By 1967, when the Public Broadcasting Act created Public Broadcasting System, PBS and National Public Radio, NPR, the Wisconsin stations had been broadcasting for 50 years. So this today is really a history of 100 years in the making. It sounds fascinating. So would you please welcome Jack Mitchell in Wisconsin on the Air.
Okay. Thank you. Let's see. I'm going to move this over. I'm going to move this over here a little bit closer to you. Well, I'm really pleased to be here on a beautiful day, and I had a chance to walk around town before I came in, and what a pretty place! It's some wonderful buildings here, and it's a real pleasure to see that. I assume that most of you are here, well, maybe because you have some interest in public broadcasting. Maybe you probably either watch public television, listen to public radio, you did at one time, or maybe you just came in for the coffee. I'm not sure which it is, but I'm wondering, just to get a feeling here, how many of you are public television watchers? Okay, just about everybody. How about public radio listeners? Pretty much not quite as many, which is typical. What is it what draws you? What is it you like about public TV or public radio? No commercials, right. Yeah, good topics, all right, yeah. Anything else? Anything you hate about it? Fund drives? Yeah, nobody likes those. But that's the choice. You don't have commercials. So that's the trade-off. But yeah, they can be annoying when they keep asking for money. But that's part of the game. Anything else that you particularly like about it? Yeah.
It's always you learn something.
You learn something. Yeah. Well, that's educational radio, educational television, which of course was not. They've tried to get rid of that name, but it's still that's what it is. Yeah. Yeah.
In-depth conversations and call-ins.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, so there's participation. Yeah, okay. Okay, those are some of the, I'm going to leave time at the end for questions. But these are some of the things that are important, and I think you'll see those themes come through as I talk here. Okay, the title of the book was Wisconsin on the Air, which I don't particularly like. But I do like the subtitle, which was 100 Years of Public Broadcasting in the State That Invented It. And I think that's really critical, that we have this state, nobody else, did this. They built this thing. And it reflects the University of Wisconsin's Wisconsin idea that the university is here to serve the entire state, not just those who are in the classroom. So that's why we invented it. But let's, I have a few slides here that are just kind of to keep me organized rather than to entertain you, because they're kind of boring if you want to know the truth. But here we are. 100 years of WHA radio. As was indicated at the very beginning, it all began in 1917. Actually, it began a little before that, because radio, Marconi invented radio back in the early 1900s. And any physics department in the country is going to teach radio. And so WHA, or 9XM as it was originally called, was built to train students on how to build radio technology. And it was Morse code, dots, dot, dashes, all those things, no voice, no music. And they were doing that in the early 1900s. It was had been going on in Science Hall, which was where the physics department was on the UW campus. Well, in order to broadcast something beyond dots and dashes, you had to have vacuum tubes. Remember your old radios and TVs, and those things, they got hot, and you burned your hands on them, and they burned out, and you had to change them. Well, you had to have those in order to have voice and music as opposed to just dots and dashes. So in 1917, Professor Terry, who was the professor in the physics department, had his students make these vacuum tubes. And they installed them in their transmitter. And in January of 1917, he said he's going to demonstrate this thing. And he had a group of people come to his house. And he had a student back at the physics lab put on a record, and it was, I forget the name of the tune. It was that one. You've heard it? Okay, that's what they played. And the folks up in his house had to listen to the radio and hear this thing. And of course, they were totally unimpressed. Why? So what? If I want to play that tune, I have a record player. I can play it right here. I don't need to have it come all the way through the physics department. And they didn't really see much promise in this, but Professor Terry did. So that's why this book came out in 2017 to mark the 100th anniversary of that voice in transmission of voice and music. Now, you'll hear other dates about this. In 1917, you recall something else happened. There was a world war. And we entered it in 1917, and all the radio stations were ordered off the air, except WHA 9XM, which was allowed to continue broadcasting dots and dashes 2 Navy ships in the Great Lakes. Not that I didn't realize there were Navy ships in the Great Lakes, but I guess the Germans could have come in through the St. Lawrence Seaway or something, but there were Navy ships in the Great Lakes, and we were broadcasting to them with dots and dashes. So we continued to be doing something, but it wasn't voice and music, nothing anybody could listen to. But in 1919, after the war ended, they started doing voice and music again. But they didn't do it very often. They didn't do it all the time, every day, just sort of once in a while. But the folks at WHA were very concerned that they make history, go down in history as the place that invented radio, the oldest station in the nation, which was their slogan. And they had to, in order to do that, they had to have 1919 as the date, even though it was kind of questionable. I would say it wasn't really true, but they were sort of doing it. And they had to do that because in 1920, KDKA in Pittsburgh went on the air and claimed to be the first radio station in the country. And so WHA, in order to have that claim, had to claim 1919. It's a little fishy, but okay, they got some pleasure out of that. The more accurate one, in my opinion, is 1921. That's when they started broadcasting every day at the same time. They put a notice in the newspaper saying, you can listen today at this time to hear this program. Seems to me that was the beginning of broadcasting in Wisconsin, a few months after KDKA in Pittsburgh. So we're not really the first, I don't think, but we make a reasonable claim. We're one of the first. And of course, the nice thing is this book, which came out in 1917, it's now it came out in 2017. It is now 2021, which is now, this is an honest book. It is now 100 years since 1921, and so I'm pleased to be this is the first time I've spoken about this in 2021. All right. So why did Wisconsin do this? It was the Wisconsin idea. It was partly the physics department's innovation. They were cutting edge even back then. But the fact that the university was committed to serving the entire state, not just students on campus. And the original programming was Farm and Home. That was, because most professors at the university then and now don't really care about serving the entire state. They want to serve their students, do their research, et cetera. But the folks in the co-op extension did. That was their job, to get information to people. And so they latched onto this and said, we could do something. So we had the first programs were for farms, the farm hour at noon. Second program was the homemaker's hour at 10 o'clock in the morning. The farmer and his wife, is what I used to call it, and then of course they had stuff for kids too. But that was the first purpose, and that's really what got us going. And that's why why buy radio? Well, in order to get that, because they had market information, all kinds of tips. It was kind of boring the way it was presented, but it was there, and it was neat. There were 3 professors, or actually, who kind of shaped it. And one professor, who I won't bother with the name because you'll forget it, and I sometimes forget it. But he was the fellow who really wanted to do this. Then there was another professor who thought that that was all beneath the great University of Wisconsin. The great University of Wisconsin shouldn't worry about recipes and things of that sort. We're big time. And so he wanted it to be liberal arts, mass education in history and science and the arts, literature. The problem was that he couldn't get very many faculty members who wanted to do that. And so it didn't work as well. He had a grand idea, it was great, but in order to get, to really going to get anybody to do it, the one thing he did manage to get out of this was classical music. There was a man, and I was just reminded of the name, Pop Gordon, Professor Gordon, did a music appreciation course in 1921 on the radio, played records, and told you about the music. And so, in classical music, these faculty members thought that any music other than classical was worthless. And so everybody ought to love classical music, and we're gonna make you do it. It's the only kind of music we're gonna play. Which was fine, actually. It was certainly wonderful, but everybody doesn't like it. So it wasn't, the farm and home stuff appealed to lots of people. This was much more narrow. And then the third kind of programming, oops, got ahead of myself. Well, it's there. There was a professor who taught debate at the university, and he thought that public radio or educational radio ought to be the place where we talk about public issues, the issues of our time, and debate them. And so they had all kinds of debates. They called them forums, the forum on this, a forum on that, and they put politicians on the air so that people could hear directly from them. And we became rather famous. The New York Times wrote up about us in saying, look at that crazy idea. We're going to put politicians on the radio. Well, maybe that wasn't such a good idea, but they did it, and it made sense, at least theoretically. But the big thing came about 10 years later in the 1930s, when they came up with this idea or this thought that the public, or the schools in the state, were mostly rural, one-room schoolhouses, maybe 2 or 3 classrooms, and that's about it. There were some places, obviously in Milwaukee and Madison, which had bigger schools, but the preponderance of schools around the state were small, and they did not have a music teacher. They did not have a science teacher. They did not have an art teacher. And the H.B. McCarty, who was the head of educational radio in those days, came up with the notion, which he actually stole from the BBC in Britain, but he didn't admit that, let's do programming for the schools. And we can put a music teacher in there. And this same Pop Gordon, who we just mentioned, did a couple of times a week, he did a music program. And the kids around the state would sing along. And he'd play the songs, and he was the only music teacher they had. The teachers loved it. I'm not sure about the kids. I think the kids did too, because they got away from the teacher for a few minutes. And the teacher could go out and have a cigarette or whatever, they break up their days. They thought it was wonderful. And they did some research and determined that actually, despite what McCarty said, the kids really didn't learn any more from the radio than they did from the teacher, but the teachers were pleased and the kids kind of enjoyed it. So they did this music show. There was a science program, Ranger Mac, A Field with Ranger Mac was the name of the show. There was an art program, drawing program, Let's Draw. Well, this is crazy, this is radio. And this Professor Schwalbach would come in and tell the kids, imagine a cloudy day. How do you feel on a cloudy day? Draw that. And they would do whatever they did. They'd mail it in, the teacher would mail all this in, and they would be judged and critiqued by people in Madison and sent back, always positive, of course, with positive comments about how wonderful this was. When television came along, they tried it on TV. And he'd say, imagine a cloudy day, and they'd show a picture of a cloudy day. And the kids would draw that picture, they'd copy it. And so radio had ironically, was better at teaching drawing than TV was. H.B. McCarty, who was the School of the Air guy, believed in making programming accessible and fun. That was his philosophy. He was more of an entertainer than educator, if you want to know the truth. Which was different from the other place that did this sort of thing was Ohio State University in Columbus. They had a bunch of academic theorists who designed the programming. And it was rigorous, and the kids would learn things if they would listen, but it was boring. And the kids didn't listen. So Wisconsin became famous for entertaining educational programming. And the fact that as I go around, people talk about how much they enjoyed listening to these shows on the radio. Well, they were fun. And he thought that was important, that it'd be fun. That not only for the kids, but for adults. That we would never be pompous or pretentious, would always be speaking in the voice of the people. And so that was the School of the Air. So that was the essence of educational radio through the 30s and 40s. Okay, let's go back to dates. 1917, you had 9XM, which was the original call letters of WHA, and then it was changed to WHA. And we've talked about how that came to be. Boing. 1947, 30 years, is that 30? Yeah. Yeah, 30 years after 1917, we did something that was really quite remarkable. And that is that the state legislature decided to build an FM network throughout the state. No other state did that. No other state came close. And here it was, 1947. Actually, the legislation was passed in 1944. These were Republican legislators. They were progressive Republicans for the most part, but Republicans, it was bipartisan. Everybody was behind this pretty much. And the idea was, and it was the School of the Air that really sold it, that why should just the kids in the Madison area be able to hear this stuff? That should be statewide. So they built a statewide FM network. In this area, WHKW in Chilton was the station. Some of you may remember that. But it was WHAD in Delafield, all, it's not the same, Brule, the station up in WHSA in Brule. Brule, why put a station up there? There are no people up there. But there are a few, and that was the point. And they had very small schools. They needed it more than Milwaukee needed it, because for the school, so they sold the state FM network on in-school programming and statewide public affairs, that we should be able to hear what the legislature is doing. We should know what state government is doing, and there was no other way to do it. We had no radio station that served the entire state. We didn't have a newspaper that served the entire state. So those were the two main arguments for the state network. (1954), television. Okay, this is going to be the salvation of the world. A lot better than radio because you got pictures. And so the proposal was that we would have a statewide television network, just like the statewide radio network. Except the politics had changed. The Republican Party of the La Follettes, Robert La Follette, Robert Jr., in 1946, Joe McCarthy defeated the La Follettes. And the Republican Party in the state changed, and it was no longer amenable to this. And this was the anti-communism time. And the feeling was you don't want government running a TV network. It would be propaganda, and it would be It was a dangerous thing. So it was, they didn't pass it, but they put it to a statewide referendum, which was defeated overwhelmingly. The only place it passed was in Madison, Milwaukee. Everybody else voted this thing down. And it was, I think, unfortunate, but that's what happened. They did build WHA-TV in Madison, however, which continued to do on TV pretty much what they'd been doing on radio. In fact, a lot of the same people. A fellow named Bob Hummey was the morning disc jockey on WHA radio, ran something called the Bandstand, where they played marching music to get you going in the morning. He created a program for WHA-TV called The Friendly Giant, in which he was the Friendly Giant. And it was distributed to other educational radio stations. And then the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation saw the show, hired him. He went up to Toronto, and the Friendly Giant continued, but it was done from Toronto rather than Madison. But WHA-TV was really a barely functioning. It was not a great operation because they had no money, and it was just the one station in Madison. Okay, so that was 50 years of educational radio and television. Now, in 1967, Congress passed the Public Broadcasting Act, which was an attempt to build a national system of educational broadcasting, except that it was not going to be educational. The whole point of the Public Broadcasting Act was to get rid of the idea of education. It didn't work, but that was the point, was that we would not do programming for schools. It would be for adults, it would be cultural, it would be a sort of an American BBC television. You know, BBC is a wonderful organization, and they wanted to build that here. That didn't fly in Congress, and what they came up with was the notion that it should not, they were afraid of it being a national BBC. They didn't want it, but they did want something that was better than commercial. And so they said it was going to be local, bedrock of localism. Okay, well, that's what Congress said, but the people who wanted to build this thing, they wanted a national BBC. So we had this certain conflict here between what the people in public broadcasting or educational broadcasting wanted and what Congress wanted. But we had this Public Broadcasting Act, which was for public television. We were going to create a system of public television. But then, very slyly, some people I know who I worked for, I was working at the University of Michigan radio station, and the manager there had one problem. Michigan did not have a TV station. Most others did. WHA had its TV station. Most educational radio stations had TV stations. Meant that Michigan wasn't going to get anything out of this. So he got the senator from Michigan to introduce a slight amendment to the Public Television Act and slip in the word "and radio." And it became the Public Broadcasting Act. And we had then the federal support for public television and for public radio. The thing is, public television was ready to go. You know, they'd been making plans on this for years. Public radio had no idea what to do. And it was so bad that I was a young person, but I saw a potential in radio. I thought it could be great. So I made it a point to talk to the people at CPB, you know, when they get this going, I really want to be part of this. There weren't any, it wasn't that I was so talented, I was just the only one. You know, that does help. So they sent me to the BBC in London, spent a year studying how did they work. And then when I came back, I was the first employee at NPR, which was barely getting, and we had to figure out what NPR was going to be. And we did, eventually. It took a while. And our first program was All Things Considered, which I was the producer of, and for about 5 years. We created this thing that's different from educational radio, certainly different from commercial radio, and it was to be, in the beginning, not necessarily news, but it became more news-oriented as it went on. The title was All Things Considered, which is all things, not just the news. So that was the Public Broadcasting Act, 1967, the beginning of NPR, the beginning of PBS, the beginning of just the booming of public broadcasting in the country. So for 50 years, WHA was kind of on its own, and the state, we were unique. Okay. A couple of years later, Wisconsin, which hadn't had educational television, decided it was time to do it. So they finally got a state TV network built, and that was begun in '69. They were largely, and I hate to be cynical, but it was partly because there was now federal money available. And so, well, why not? So they built this thing, and it was, and the other thing that was kind of perverse about it is that they said it's going to be for instruction. Now, the National Act had said it's not for instruction. So they were going to try to get this national bill, but do a television of the air kind of thing for the schools. And that was the rationale. So we had now a TV network along with the radio network, and I think I may be getting a new mic. They're coming to the rescue.
Technology is fabulous.
It
when
is,
works.
Ned. Yeah, thank you. Good. All right, there we go. All right, so now we have the state television network built with the idea that it's education. And you have now a long period of time when it was unclear who was really in charge of educational television, or radio for that matter, in the state. The university, which built WHA and had all the programming, or this Educational Communications Board, which owned all the transmitters. And it was a lot of tension, and viewers and listeners didn't know it. Those who were working there knew it very severely. In 1979, 10 years after all this happened, I had left NPR and was now here as manager of WHA, and we said, this is crazy. So we put the two together, WHA and the ECB stations, into something we call Wisconsin Public Radio, and it was united again as one system. The other piece of Wisconsin Public Radio is that we decided we'd have two networks. We had the ECB's network, which had been existing, and then the university had a lot of stations. And so, like in Oshkosh, places like that. So we got some of those on board. So we had two networks, statewide networks. One which became known as the Ideas Network, and the other which was NPR News and Classical. 10 years after that, it happened in radio partly because nobody cared about radio, but television they did care about, and so they kept their battles going on that for another 10 years, and then in 1989 they did in television what we had done in radio, put the whole thing back together as Wisconsin Public Television. Oops. Okay, what about the next 100 years? It's going to change, I think, rather drastically. I'm not sure how quickly. On the 75th anniversary of WHA, I said it was all going to change, and here it is another 30 years after, and hasn't changed all that much. But basically the change is going to be from broadcasting, where you have a single program service for everybody, that everybody kind of watches or listens to at the same time. And we're replacing that with narrowcasting, Netflix, and on TV where you watch what you want to watch when you want to watch it, not when somebody says you should watch it. And there are infinite variety of stuff. And the old idea that we were going to educate the public by having an educational radio network, an educational TV network that would get people, say, to love classical music, which was one of the goals, that's not going to work because people have so many choices. If there's only one choice, back when WHA was the only radio station in the state, you could say, all right, we're going to push classical music, because what else is there? They can turn it on or turn it off. If they turn it on, they're going to do classical music. Well, now of course you can't, there's so many choices that you can't inflict or give people things that they don't want. So now, with podcasts and other kinds of things, everybody's going to have what they want, when they want it. And that's wonderful in many ways. But there is a downside, which of course is that there's no common thing. There's nothing that everybody sees or experiences at the same time. And so the notion of unity of national unity is going to be downgraded. All things considered, when it started, the goal was to have something that everybody would want to listen to. Now, we never did it, really, but that was the goal. And that we'd have all kinds of material, all kinds of stuff there, all kinds of different voices, different issues, and everybody would want it. Now, not because NPR decided this, but because listeners could go wherever they wanted, it became very much a high-end news service, which appeals strongly to some people and repels other people. And so there's no way that all things considered can be all things to all people. Just can't. It might have been when it started, but can't now. So this notion, and public television was supposed to have something for everybody. Well, it doesn't. It appeals to a rather significant but narrow group of people who tend to be better educated, older, and not appeal at all very much to young people, except for kids, which have lots of stuff. But after you graduate from Sesame Street and before you get to Masterpiece Theater, there's kind of a gap where people are kind of left out. And there's nothing public TV can really do about that, because you can't be covering everybody when there are so many choices. And so that's either the promise or the dilemma of the future. And I say, leave it. I have a mixed feeling, frankly, personally, about whether this is good or bad. I see the good in it. Why shouldn't people be able to watch and listen to what they want? And on the other hand, shouldn't there be something that we all share? Okay, that's what I've prepared. But I really would rather hear from you and your questions and comments. So we earlier said, some of you like public broadcasting because of it educates, and it does. It tries to. That was the whole point, and that was the whole point of why it began in 1917, was to educate the public, and it still does that. But is that, what kind of questions or comments might you have about, as listeners and viewers, you have probably more experience with public broadcasting than I do, certainly collectively, and from the consumer side, which is really more important than the producer's side. So I'm curious what's on your mind, what kind of, yes, way in the back. Okay. Why? What's wrong with you?
I just saw the look on my head and tells me something, even though that happened. Oh, yeah, I already know that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, what's wrong with you? Were you dropped on the head as a child, or? Okay.
I think a little educated.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it is people who love radio particularly. Radio is more polarizing. You love it or hate it kind of thing, and those who love it a lot. Television, there's a little bit less loyalty there, but there's a lot, but it's not quite as polarizing. And people don't hate public TV the way some people hate public radio. Yeah. Yeah.
I just have a comment that I hadn't even thought about
Yeah.
till what you had said,
Yeah.
how to appeal to everyone. When my children were little, the first one was born in 71 and the last one in 78, Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers, we never missed.
I know.
And it was wonderful because we didn't have a lot of playmates,
Right.
you know, living
Sure.
in the country.
Yeah.
And I know they learned it a really lot.
Yes.
I'm thankful they had that.
Oh, absolutely. Sesame Street was the PBS, the first major PBS program. See, it started, I think, with PBS, 1979, or I'm sorry, 69. And my daughter, who was also born in 71, loved Sesame Street.
Well, was Mr. Rogers the same station?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Okay, it's so long ago.
Yeah, no, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, who actually she liked even better than Sesame Street. And great, wonderfully, Mr. Rogers was genuinely a sweet person that he came across. Yeah. And we were living in Washington, or up in Maryland at that time, and Mr. Rogers was going to appear at WETA, the Washington station. So we got our daughter in the car and off we went. WETA in those days was located on South 9th Street in Arlington. Little did I know that there's also a North 9th Street in Arlington. So we went off and we're chasing around, and we were on North, couldn't find WETA. So we must have wasted a half hour, and finally we realized we'd made a mistake, I'd made a mistake. And we found South 9th Street, and we went in and it was over. Mr. Rogers had done his thing, and somebody went backstage and said to him, a little girl came here to see you, and he came out. He came out and spent a lot of time just talking to my daughter, and I didn't have to do that. But he is where he was. He's died since. And there's been a couple of movies about him recently that were really quite nice, and it's genuine. He is what he was. I remember one of the people at NPR who had worked in public television where Mr. Rogers was, and how he had goldfish on his set. And apparently over one weekend, they had gotten very cold and the fish died. And he came in Monday morning and was genuinely upset. Nobody had ever seen him angry before, but somebody had let his fish die. Can't do that. Well, they went out and bought new fish, it was fine, but that wasn't the point. These fish deserve to be kept comfortable. Yeah, Mr. Rogers is quite special. Sesame Street was not as, there's been a lot of research about that, and it really what they found is that all the kids learned a lot. When they got to school, they were kind of bored because you didn't have these little animated figures telling you how to read and how to count and all that. It was school became less entertaining than Sesame Street, and that was some rebound on that. Yeah.
Can you say something about the funding and compare it to the British broadcasting?
Yes. Okay, BBC. Yeah, okay, the question was about funding for public broadcasting. The BBC is simple. Everybody who has a TV set in Britain pays an annual license fee, sort of like your automobile registration. You know, you pay $100 or whatever it is a year in order to use the public roads. In Britain, you pay something like $125 a year in order to use the public airwaves. And so the BBC, their domestic programming, is totally funded by this license fee. It produces a tremendous amount of money. They are filthy rich. They can do almost anything. They can send people all over the world. You know, now it's being cut back because depending on which government is in there, Labor tends to be more in favor of the BBC, the Conservatives less so. But even so, nobody has the nerve to really cut it badly. Their their overseas service was funded by, and I guess still is, by the Foreign Office. It's a foreign relations, public relations thing. It's very neutral, it's very highly respected, but what they want to show is that Britain is the place where quality continues. And so that's the BBC. They're simple. The United States, we have a core, it varies from place to place. Here, let's talk about Wisconsin. Wisconsin, the state of Wisconsin and the University of Wisconsin continue to put a fair amount of money into public radio and TV. I don't know what the percentage is. The federal money is only about 5 or 6%, and that comes from the federal. And what's increased over the years, and it was 0 when I started, was listener support, viewer support, which is now about half of the income. And so it's a mix. And I think the mix is good in the sense that no one source is fatal. You could lose all that federal money and it'd still continue. It would hurt, but it would. I don't know that you could lose all of listener support and viewer support and have it continue. Although we did function very nicely before there was any viewer or listener support, but it has allowed it to grow a lot. And so public broadcasting is much bigger now than when I started about the time of the Public Broadcasting Act. The thought with the Public Broadcasting Act that the federal government would pay for most of it. That never happened. But it's now very heavily viewer and listeners. Underwriting, which is basically quasi-advertising, is a relatively small part, but it's kind of significant too. But listeners and viewers are the big part. Yeah?
I miss the old-time radio drama.
I know. I do too.
I just miss that so much.
Yeah. Well, that was controversial, to say the least.
Really?
What's that?
That was controversial?
Oh, yeah. It's controversial that it went away. It was, some people like you loved it, and I liked it, and a lot of people did. It was, reminded me of my youth. I used to listen to all those things when they were actually broadcast in the 1940s and that. But the argument was, and you can agree or disagree, that it was all white. The way the world was then. The 1930s, 40s, 50s, it was just, the only black person you had was, what was the guy on? Rochester, yes, who was kind of a lovable character, but he was not exactly, was not somebody to be highly respected. And so you had so there was that. And of course, women were very minor. They were supporting characters. There were no stars except maybe my Miss Brooks. Our Miss Brooks was, those were my favorites actually. And so they felt that this was giving an unrealistic impression of a white male-dominated world. And it was. I mean, that's the thing. It was, to my mind, it's not what you want to have today, and maybe not even really what exists today, but it was what it was in the 1940s and 30s. And so I think as an historical artifact, it was great. But the folks who are making the decisions decided they needed to eliminate that. Yeah,
Well, I dislike commercials, so.
good for you.
And I mute them all the time.
Me too.
They're so loud and just poorly done. So that's one reason I like public television.
Sure.
And radio. And I also like the fact that I know on radio that Larry Mueller will have computer problems on Monday, and he'll have gardening
Oh,
and
yeah.
on Friday, so you know just when it's going to be. And I like chapter a day, which
Yep.
introduces you to books,
Yep.
even though I don't always hear everything.
Well, no, nobody does. That's one of the problems with chapter a day, is that nobody hears all of them. You know, so you hear one chapter and then you miss three and you hear another one. But people still watch, they still listen to it. Even so, it really should be a podcast. Then you can just get it and listen. But
And
they,
the other thing I like is we have all our radio stations in the cars on public radio stations. So wherever we go in the state,
yeah,
and even when we are out of state, we can get a public radio.
yeah,
a
oh
national
yeah.
one. So
Yes.
that's all we listen to when we're out.
Okay, well, I'm sorry. Yeah, no, I beat you. I don't even know what's on the commercial stations. And in terms of the commercials, the advertising is slipping into public broadcasting, and they are becoming, it used to be, and the law says that you have to tell your viewers and listeners who paid for this program. And so, and it had to be, this program was made possible by a grant from the Mobil Oil Company. All right, I can see that, and that's fine. But that's all that's required by law. But then they said, well, which Mobil Oil Company? Well, the one that sells, premium and all this. And so on the idea that you're being more clear about who this is, they've allowed it to eventually kind of go into semi-commercials. What you cannot do is advocate, you can never say, go and buy this gasoline, or that it is the best gasoline. So you can, but you can describe the product and the location and the logo so that people know exactly who this is. So it's a matter of identifying the sponsor as opposed to telling you to use that sponsor's product. And as long as they keep on that side of the line, it's legal. To me, I think they've pushed it farther than they should, but that's me. I'm old, Yeah, way in the back.
I'm wondering which programs we currently have in podcasts, Central Time, Garden Talk.
Yeah.
Which are now podcasted as well as live?
Well, almost everything can be podcast, but the ones that they push, and the most popular is, to the best of our knowledge, which is national. It's distributed nationally, so people across the country download that podcast. Of the local programs, the most popular is, and I was surprised to hear this, Garden Talk. Because, and why? Well, it's because I think it's as somebody pointed out, it's there every week. It's good, pretty much what it's going to be. It's always interesting if you care about gardens. 50% of the, maybe 75% of the public doesn't care about gardens, but for that 25% that does, that's really a valuable program. So some of the others are not so popular, not so well listened to. I'm surprised there's a program called Beta, which is about pop culture, and that doesn't do that well. But it's the old-fashioned garden talk that is the top one, other than to the best of our knowledge. Yeah.
Talking about Sesame Street, and we talked about funding. Now, Sesame Street has licensed, clothing,
Yeah.
books,
Right.
Does
Yeah.
money from all of that licensed stuff go back into?
Goes back to Sesame Street. Yeah, what's happened, and this is not unusual. Most public TV shows are not produced by, in fact, none of them are produced by PBS. PBS by law is not allowed to produce programs. They have to acquire programs from others. Most of those shows are acquired from stations like PBS, or like WGBH in Boston, Masterpiece Theater. That's a WGBH production. But some of them, like Sesame Street, are just produced by private companies. It's called the Sesame Workshop. It's a private company. And they do all kinds of things that are not public television, including, and it all goes to them. That's the money that when you buy a t-shirt or a toy, the money goes to the Sesame Street Workshop, which does good work, but it does not go to your local PBS station or to PBS itself. Way in the back.
I'm wondering if you could speak to the difference in viewer-supported funding across the country.
Yes. The question is about viewer support across the country. I do not know absolutely, but there are many public broadcasting stations that are totally or almost totally viewer supported and listener supported. And that's very possible in a big city like New York. WNYC in New York, which is the public radio station there, was owned by the city of New York. And it was paid for by your property taxes in New York. A few years ago, they spun it off into a private corporation. The city has nothing to do with it anymore, and it's totally supported by listeners in the New York area. Now, granted, there are, 12 million people in the New York area, and so you get 10% of them supporting it. That's a lot of money. But so in some places, its viewers and listeners are probably almost all of it. Small places, if you were in Joplin, Missouri, that has to be subsidized by probably a university in that case. So it depends on where you are, on how much subsidy is used. Here in Wisconsin, we have probably a bigger subsidy than just about anybody else. A place like Milwaukee could support a TV or radio station, certainly, without much public tax support. Madison probably could. The rest of the state, no. There's not enough people. But so where there's low population, it tends to be heavy on taxes. And even the state TV network was justified mostly not by the service it can provide in Madison and Milwaukee, but by what it can do in Park Falls, where there just aren't enough people to support a public TV station there. So that's kind of how it works out. Yeah?
A program like the Rick Steves program.
Yes.
I suspect he's benefiting greatly from all the time
Oh,
that
yes.
he gets. What is the relationship in that kind of position?
Yeah, I'm not absolutely sure, but Rick Steves is an independent production. So he is the producer, he is the owner. He sells the programming to PBS or NPR. I think it's on both. Yeah, I know he's on PBS. And he sells it, they sell it to the stations. The stations decide which programs they're going to carry. They send the money to PBS. PBS then sends the money to Rick Steves. And so I don't know exactly what that relationship is, but that's, so he does fine. And he gets to go all over the world. He's got a good gig. Yeah.
What's the most popular broadcast, nationally broadcast program on public radio of all time?
Of all time, probably Morning Edition. I say that because for many years there were three, Morning Edition, All Things Considered, and A Prairie Home Companion. They were the three tent poles. And if you look at the ratings, you go up, and then down, 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 and then up for All Things Considered, and then down, 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 and then nothing on weekends until you get to 5 o'clock Saturday night, and then whoa. So those are the three. Car Talk was another one. that got a lot of listenership. But it was only an hour a week, and that didn't matter that much. But it's the NPR news magazines are the key to the whole thing. Yeah.
I would think the Ken Burns series are very popular.
Oh, yes. No, Ken Burns is very popular. Yeah, on TV. Yeah, he was asking about radio, but yeah, Ken Burns is very popular. I think Masterpiece Theater is probably the main program that draws, yeah, most listeners. Yeah, yes, sir.
How is the Fine Tuning magazine now paid for?
Fine Tuning, that's the public TV, yeah. It's paid by you. It was, you know, if you contribute, a piece of what you contribute goes to that. Radio got rid of its program guide years ago. I think public TV should too, but they don't think so. And so, yeah, that's paid for a little, very small part of what you contribute, if you contribute, goes to that. Yeah. Yeah.
I remember that when we did funding, like, I think it was at the state level, a percentage had to go to national broadcasting.
Well, yes. It's complicated. But the way the system works now, the stations collect the money. That's, and in order to have national programs, the stations then send money to NPR and PBS and other places. So the stations buy programming from the networks. And there was a time back when I was at NPR, the entire place was funded by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. In fact, one day they opened my mail and there was a check for $1 million from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I got it in my mailbox instead of somebody else's. But they would send us a check every month for $1 million. Well, it wasn't that. Oh, maybe that was 3 months. But anyway, they paid us directly. NPR got into serious, almost went bankrupt in 1983. And CPB was very angry. And so they cut off NPR and said all the money is going to the stations. But the stations have to use part of that to buy national programs, but not necessarily from NPR. It can be from PRI, which was at that point doing Prairie Home Companion. And Prairie Home Companion was never an NPR show. So you could buy it from different places. So, but yes, the stations, a piece of the money must go to national sources. And of course, most of those, particularly in television, almost all of the money that you contribute is used to pay the PBS dues. They're huge. They pay, and they have good programs, so that's why. Where in the case of public radio, much more of it is local, because a lot of the programming is local. And there's not too much local programming on PBS, on WHATV. Yeah?
Like Outdoor Wisconsin and Common Giver,
Yes.
is that produced in Milwaukee?
Yes, Milwaukee is not part of the Wisconsin public television system. They had, back when they wanted to build a state network, TV network in 1954, and the voters voted it down. Milwaukee grabbed the 2 channels that had been assigned to Milwaukee and built their own station. It was this technical college did it. And so they are separate. And then years later, when they did build the state TV network, Milwaukee already had its stations. So Milwaukee is not part of Wisconsin public television. And they do produce other pros, like John McGiven and this part. What's that? We carry it. Yeah, they are carried, WMT, I assume that Wisconsin Public Television buys it from them, from Channel 10 in Milwaukee. It may be that Channel 10 in Milwaukee sells underwriting for the program, keeps that money, and is happy to have, they can charge more if it's carried statewide. But yeah, that's Milwaukee separate, and same with radio. There is a separate Milwaukee public radio station that's separate from the state network. Now the state network is also in Milwaukee. They have both. But for TV, it's only, Milwaukee only has their local stations. Yeah.
Why does this goes back to Milwaukee television.
Yeah.
Milwaukee television, public television has maybe 5 or 6 channels. And actually, I can only get 2 of them on my cable.
Yep. Okay.
It seems like a waste.
Well, they think so too. They are going to sell Channel 36 and make lots of money and use that to subsidize Channel 10 and to and their other. See, the other thing that's new is that with digital television, you have 3 or 4 subchannels that you can get. So you have WPNE has subchannels. You can get. You should? No?
Can't get it on my cable.
Well, oh, cable. Yeah, well, the cable companies decide what to carry.
They sell 36. There's one of my primary channels that goes right there.
Yeah. No, that's not good. But they realize that they have one channel more than they can support, and if they sell it, it's worth a lot of money. They will be able to subsidize Channel 10 for indefinitely. Anything else? Oh, yes, over here.
So, if this is correct, that Wisconsin and Milwaukee Public Television sell 36, will that become part of Wisconsin Public Television?
Well, they would like that, but the thing is, Wisconsin Public Television couldn't come up with the money to buy it. You know, it's expensive. And a commercial broadcaster will spend millions of dollars for that channel. And Wisconsin Public Television couldn't, can't. So, no, I don't think so.
So if it's sold, it could go to a commercial?
Oh, it will.
And then it's entirely different.
Totally different. Yeah, they'll just put all their effort into to Channel 10 and the sub-channels, because there are now 2 or 3 sub-channels. And so there's PBS Kids is on a sub-channel. And what else is there? There's a Create Network. Yeah. WPT2, those are the sub-channels. And cable does tend to carry them. At least in Madison they do. I don't know about Green Bay. And they're perfectly fine. And if you have a digital TV, you can get all those channels. So you really don't need a Channel 36 if everybody has digital, which they will eventually. Yeah?
Those channels were granted by FCC for educational purposes. How can they then be sold for commercial purposes?
Well,
That doesn't seem right.
it doesn't seem right. I'm not sure. That's a very good point. Yeah, you're right. Hey, what's going on here? No, that's right. It's, I don't know. But the FCC is, in order to help public TV, is very loose about some of those principles that they started with, including the underwriting. Most of the underwriting that's on TV now wouldn't have been permitted when this whole thing was started. But they've said, okay, sure, I guess just don't say, go to that store and buy something. You can say where that store is and what they sell, but don't tell anybody to buy it. Yeah, so the FCC has been very loose about its regulations on TV. So that's a good point. That channel was allocated for non-commercial use. You are right. And I don't know how they're going to get around that, but I suspect they will. Well, maybe they won't. I don't know. Yeah.
I'm a person that doesn't listen all the time to either public radio or public TV.
Yeah.
But when I have time or when I'm driving the car, that's when I turn it on.
Sure.
And it's always something interesting. May not be my favorite thing.
Right.
But it's interesting. And it's always not offensive.
Always what?
Not offensive,
Yeah, hardly ever, yeah.
not yelling about something.
Oh, yeah. No, it's tasteful, if nothing else. Yeah, it can be boring sometimes, but come on. But it is tasteful and usually interesting. Yeah.
I think you developed favorites as far as movies, Pokey Rogers, and so on.
Oh, yeah.
But the latest one that I really enjoy is Paul Simon.
Paul?
Scott Simon.
Oh, Scott Simon, yes. Oh, yeah.
On Saturday morning.
Yeah, I was listening to him on the way up.
He is just wonderful. If you
Yeah.
haven't listened to him, try it.
Yes, well, I was chairman of the board of NPR back when we created that program, and I played a role in that because I believed in him so much. And but NPR is downplaying personalities now. They started with strong personalities like Susan Stamberg and Cokie Roberts, and there were others that, Robert Siegel. But they've decided to build the brand, not individuals. And Scott Simon is sort of the last of the personalities, who is very distinctive. So when he retires, and it can't be too much longer because he's almost my age, but he will probably not be replaced by anybody as distinctive. I'm a huge fan of his. Yeah.
Well, and the stories he finds and the people he interviews
Yeah.
are always
Yeah. No, he's excellent. And they only have to do it once a week, which helps. And he has a staff that works all week to come up with these things. Yeah.
What programs did Wisconsin Public Radio produce in Madison that were broadcast nationally?
Yes. There's not much left. A few years back, I think they made the decision that they were not going to be a national player. When I was there, I wanted to be. So we do have, well, the big one was What Do You Know? And that was a very popular national show for a while, but it became tired and lost stations. To the best of our knowledge is the other big one, that it never became as popular as To the Best of Our Knowledge, as Feldman, but does well. Zorba Pastor on Your Health is distributed nationally. And we had a couple of others. Trish McConnell, The Pet Show, that was a hit. And then she decided she didn't want to do it anymore. But that was really a shame because people love their pets. And it was a big hit nationally. So now it's really, I think, just Zorba, To the Best of Our Knowledge, are the only two, I think. And they'll probably, when Zorba retires, and when Steve and Ann retire, I suspect those will go away too. Because the commitment now is not for national, but to serve the state. And that's fine. Yeah.
As a sustainer for public television and public radio, we get to do all the podcasts we want
Yeah.
that the PBS offers, and it's always nice if we missed a show.
Oh, yeah.
A mystery show, we love mystery on Sunday night, and if we miss one, I can go back to the podcast and we can pick that up.
Yeah. No, I agree. We do that too. And in fact, I hardly ever watch it live anymore. We have a Roku and the PBS. Yeah, that's really good.
And I think the news hour too, we tend to watch it over our dinner.
Yep.
And the thing is, we're getting yesterday's news.
Well, that's a problem, yeah.
We eat after 6 o'clock or 6:30. I can find it down below.
Yeah, yes you can.
Watch it today.
Yeah, no, it's true.
Why is it? Do they have to delay it? Because it's on national?
Well, you're supposed to watch it live. I guess that's what they want. But then but it's available afterwards. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I don't know why. I don't know. Yeah.
We don't have that live one upstairs. We have it down.
Yeah, I know. It's they make life tricky. And that PBS app is kind of hard to use. It's not as easy as Netflix. That's my gripe. But they have some great stuff. Yeah, we watch it all the time. Yeah,
Well, if you use Ruco, as you talked
Yeah.
about, and then you have PBS passports,
yep.
that's the simplest thing in the world to tune in, pick up.
You can get it.
These
Yeah,
masterpiece shows that you missed.
yeah, yeah. But they don't have a thing that says continue watching, and you have to go back and remember what episode you were on. And where Netflix says continue watching, and it gives you the next thing you. So they're not quite as. Their content's wonderful, but their technology isn't quite up to Netflix. Anything else? I've kept you away from the sunshine for an awful long time. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, by the way, I did bring along some copies of the book. It's now out of date. This was for supposed to be in 2017. But if you want to, you can have them for $10 a piece. If you want to take one, please do.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Now remember, we're back here in September, not until then. Make sure you have fun. I mean, we just finally get to see each other again. But anyway, make sure you attend everything you can this summer. Have fun. Go outside, take your mask off. Do something fun historically, and we will see you in September.